I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
And today we will be continuing our draft profiles with Ausar Thompson and Gradey Dick, two of Jaren's favorite players. Jaren, could you give everybody a bit of debrief before we get into this podcast over the guys that we'll be going over here today?
Yeah, you get not the off-brand brother and the Thompson twins, but you get Ausar Thompson, who could potentially be one of the highest potential players, but also probably has a pretty high bust potential. And that inside that top 10, and you also got Gradey Dick, which the Mavericks, I believe, have already listed out as a top 10 pick, or at least that's sort of the rumors. Even though they did actually have him in a team workout, I do believe. But yeah, I mean, two players. Ausar Thompson definitely more defensive minded than Gradey Dick. Gradey Dick more of an offensive talent, but I guess just depending on which way the Mavericks go, like I wouldn't throw it out entirely that the Mavericks could pick Gradey Dick at number 10, just seeing how the sort of trade market shapes up. But I'm not totally opposed to it, and I guess like this will be our podcast explaining why. But I do know that he is very quick to be sort of thrown under the bus. And look, if I'm being honest, and I think we kind of share the same sort of feeling here, like Gradey, I mean, he's honestly not as bad as a player as we really thought. He has some potential upside on defense as well. And I know, like I said, we're going to discuss this on the podcast, but I wouldn't totally opt him out of a Mavericks contract. I wouldn't be opposed to it. So I guess that's what I have to say.
Yeah, no, definitely. He actually has a little bit more upside in some of his more underdeveloped areas, and I think people would give him credit for. Just for both of these guys, I guess, just give a brief description of their game before we go ahead and get into the podcast here.
Yeah, Ausar Thompson, definitely more of a sort of defending, almost wing type player. Has a little bit of a playmaking upside as well, but definitely on offense, you're going to get a little bit more of the flash rather than consistency is what it kind of seems like. He's going to be those kind of guys that could potentially put up 20 and then put up a little bit as far as like a 5-point game the next night. So, but the defensive sort of consistency is what sort of lies. He could be, or at least he's been outlined as the potential best player on the defensive end of this draft. Him or Taylor Hendricks has sort of been the sort of debate. And then also, with Gradey Dick, this is much more of an offensive talent, as I mentioned before, an amazing three-point shooter, and also just an amazing off-ball sort of player to have on any team. He would definitely be a guy that would be extremely awesome to surround with Luka, just regarding the offensive style. And then defensively, he's a little bit more long with that 6'9" frame, I believe. Definitely has a little bit more of a longer wingspan and can use that to his potential, or use that on his defensive side if everything does click. But then again, these are two players that should be maybe not Ausar Thompson, but for sure Gradey Dick. They'll be more available at that 10 area rather than the previous three that we did talk about earlier. But yeah, these should be more gettable guys compared to the other three, like I said. So we'll see who's available at number 10 and what the Mavericks do, of course, with that pick. But Gradey Dick, I think, will be available at 10, and Ausar Thompson will be a little bit more of a stretch, but I wouldn't be surprised if he goes past 10.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be interesting to see as we continue to do these draft profiles, because we're kind of starting from the top. Once we start covering those guys in the lower echelon, if the Mavericks were to possibly trade back for a pick, maybe some certain guys that we'll start profiling even in the 14 to 20 range, even though the Mavericks are at 10, just because of the volatility of what could happen with their pick. We're going to be doing our due diligence for a pretty large portion of the first round here. So you can catch more of that in the ensuing episodes we got coming out for the rest of these week as we continue to do these draft profiles for you guys. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, Jaren. So starting off here with Ausar Thompson, this is a guy that played in the OTE league last year. He was one of the guys that did not opt to go to college, played a lot of EYBL leading up to that. Obviously, we see the evolution of the, overtime league and all these different outlets for players who may not want to go to college. We saw that route with Jaden Hardy, who has been, pretty wildly successful here on the Mavericks after spending a year with the G League Ignite, of course, of the NBA's developmental program. But this overtime league, the Thompson twins are kind of headlined and showcased here as some of the, really first people to come out of this overtime league straight to the NBA. I guess the first question I have for you in regards to Ausar Thompson, before we even get into the sort of dichotomy between his, positives and negatives as a player, do you think that the lack of competition in the overtime league is giving, people a false sense of hope for either of the Thompson twins here?
Yeah, I mean, it possibly could. I think that there's definitely questions that should be answered, or that should be asked rather. But again, I mean, these are two guys that are just like they're gifted freaks right here. I mean, their bodies, their athleticism, like they're absolute freaks at this level. I'm not really quite sure like what their high school rankings were or anything like that, but I mean, they were good enough to I guess opt into I don't know if it's pro-am or if it's professional. I'm not quite sure of OT. I'm not like sure of those sort of intricacies, but I do know that a lot of up and coming guys or former college players are playing in that. So I would, potentially say it might not be as good as the G League per se, but it could be a little bit higher of a league than compared to the NCAA or college. Because again, I mean, these are
there's a lot of high school kids in it too, though, and
is there? Okay.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. Just from what I've gathered a little bit more, especially watching them play, it just seemed, especially defensively, like the effort wasn't as
To me,
as college.
yeah, to me, I think because it is a shorter season. I believe it's 15 games and then playoffs. So to me, I think it's sort of the first half, like if you could compare it to anything, probably like the first 20 games of the NBA season where, the team sort of chemistry isn't quite there yet. Guys are still figuring things out, but the good players are sticking out. And I think that's kind of what OTE sort of is to me. Because again, I'm not quite sure how long their camps are or anything like that, but it kind of just seemed like there was a draft, the season was happening, and then you go and play in the finals. And I believe that it was like the City Reapers, whatever the Amen and Ausar played for. I believe they won the championship in OTE, but I think that that's more of a sort of, you have 1 year to prove it sort of thing, and they proved it. So I'm not gonna take too much out of that for them, but again, I mean, there could be some concerns there, like chemistry wise, availability coming in the league, pro readiness. There could be availability, or there could be questions there. But I mean, with these two guys, with what we've seen on tape, I think there's enough said there. And I mean, like I said, like these are two athletically gifted freaks, and I mean, they're all around great basketball players. Ausar, of course, being an all around great defensive player.
Yeah, no, most definitely. Both of these guys are, the ultimate sort of 3-and-D filler prospect, archetypes, right? Even though, both of them are still, somewhat developing that playmaking aspect and shot creation aspect of things, even though, Amen has probably transcended Ausar in that aspect. These are still two guys that, could come in and be, transcendent talents in terms of their potential. Both of them obviously, got a lot at stake here in this coming draft. Ausar, he's definitely, I think, a little bit more conservative in terms of his game compared to Amen. Maybe doesn't, try as much offensively. Maybe doesn't, handle as much of a burden, but nonetheless, he arguably is an equally talented player, just in a different sort of way. What, differences are we going to see from his game compared to his brothers?
Yeah, I mean, with his game, I would say Almond is definitely more of a offensive talent, more of an offensive guru. And with Ausar, he's definitely more of a defensive guru. I think there's really no negatives outside of possibly the occasional effort play. I don't think that there's any negatives inside of his defensive game. Definitely, as his sort of rookie season sort of prevails, there'll definitely be more questions, and more of those sort of questions will get answered. But from what we can see on tape and what we can see in the OTE league, there was really no holes in his offense other than sort of, a weak side shot blocker, like things that his body isn't able to do. Like for what he's probably going to be, what his role is going to be, I think, it was dang near A plus. But yeah, I think outside of the occasional effort plays, he's much more of an offensive guru. I'm not quite sure on Amon's game. I know, he's much more of a like sort of top 5 lock. So if I'm going to be honest, I haven't really looked too much into his game. All I know is that he's much more offensively gifted compared to Ausar, but I really don't think their games sort of spread apart too much. I think, like I said, outside of occasional shot making, and maybe a little bit playmaking, like I think that's probably the only thing that separates them, or at least consistency wise. But yeah, I do know for Ausar that offensively, the things that sort of make him a little different is he's a much more he's a very half court driven player, in the sense that he knows the half court sort of system very well, which I think will honestly bode him well in most NBA systems, and especially Dallas's, because we saw them before Kyrie came in with the slowest pace, and I think that they could find some sort of balance there, if he was on that roster. But yeah, I mean, I think outside of that, his playmaking, definitely needs improvement. Shot making a little bit, sort of creativity wise. But yeah, I mean, I think he's ready to sort of take that leap. He's just much more of a sort of developmental sort of project rather than Amen.
What would you you talked about Ozir's half court sort of readiness. What would you kind of attribute to that? Is it because of his cutting, his ability to attack off a closeout, his shooting? What makes him so dynamic in the half court?
Yeah, I mean, he just understands the spacing very well. He understands the sort of cuts that are needed, and just sort of off-ball movements that are needed. I think he's much more of a team player, or maybe not team player is the right word, but much more of a sort of a role player in that sense, where he's not going to take the leads, he's not going to sort of be that star. So he's going to be the guy that you sit next to Luka, Kyrie, and he can play really well off of those guys. And I think that's sort of what the Mavericks do need. So if he were to fall, that would honestly, I wouldn't be opposed to taking him at number 10. But yeah, I mean, he just understands spacing. He understands, where everything needs to be, timing cuts, sort of plays, everything like that, that aligns with the spacing side of the ball. He understands that. He's honestly, I would say in this draft, one of the better sort of half court guys, maybe outside of Gradey Dick, who, is just an offensive guru. But yeah, I think, he understands that very well. And even in transition, he's a very talented, gifted transition passer. I think, on par with maybe not Josh Green, but I could see him work up into those levels where he's pushing with guys like Jaden Hardy, Josh Green, in transition, which we saw those two really go to work last year, is where we saw them sort of separate their game from some of the other Mavericks. But yeah, I mean, I think that transition, half court wise, like he's definitely much more of a project player on that side of the ball. But yeah, where he hits the stride is definitely defensively.
Yeah. Obviously both of the Thompson twins have kind of made a label off of, the sort of archetype that I referenced earlier. These extremely non one-dimensional 3-and-D wings, which kind of sounds counterintuitive because you're like, whoa, wait, is this guy basically just a playmaker or at this point? But I mean, these guys, are tried and true in terms of having the sort of archetype that we see in terms of some of the more elite two-way wings in today's game. And their body, of course, I think for both of them is still developing a little, but I wouldn't say that it's as lackluster as a lot of prospects their age. And more often than not, I think most people would carry the opinion that they both have NBA ready bodies. Obviously, the only thing that in Ozir's case that where he kind of veers away from that sort of label in terms of being the ultimate two-way wing is his lack of an outside shot. He shot 31% from three in catch and shoot scenarios last year. How is his development going to translate that going to translate to the NBA level in regards to his catch and shoot three, especially in a system with multiple dynamic playmakers like a Luka Doncic or potentially even Kyrie Irving if he were to resign? Is he going to be able to, develop that as young as he is in the coming years, or do you think just based off his shot mechanics and what have you that you kind of see him this being a guy that is never able to become an elite shooter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's young enough to develop a shot, which is definitely on the upside of his sort of top 10 pick potential. But yeah, I mean, you do bring up a good point. The lack of an outside shot, especially for the role that he's expected to play, if he were to go to Dallas rather. Luka's already here, and there is a possibility of Kyrie resigning. He'd have to take much more of a step back in the sort of active department. He's not going to have the ball in his hands as much. He's not going to be able to run plays through his hands as much compared to what he did in OTE last year. But he's definitely going to have to take a little bit of a step back there, and he's going to have to definitely develop his shot. I think if he wants to be successful in this league, rather for anybody in that matter, you're going to have to develop some sort of consistency from the 3-point line and just in general. I think, his sort of talent is maybe not talent, but his sort of ceiling is sort of capped from where his offensive game sort of ends. His 3-point shot isn't quite there yet. Even whenever he has the ball in his hands, it's sort of lackluster at times. Driving angles are a big question. How can he get to his spots? Because he's had a little bit of a question there coming into the league, of course. And I think, if you can develop half of that, of course, going into this rookie year, like it would bode him really well. Especially being in a system, like I said, where, where you said rather, where there are going to be possibility of 2 ball dominant guys that you're going to run the offense through. To see him sort of work off of those guys is probably going to be key. And especially in the shooting department, if he could find, again, some sort of consistency from 3, that would really bode him well, and probably his career progression extremely well.
Yeah, he honestly seemed like a little bit better of a pull-up shooter than he was from catching 3 when we watched, some of his draft profile breakdowns. And, a lot of those possessions, he did look like his base on his shot was just a little off. If I recall correctly, he almost did like a little heel click kind of thing, but he does get really good elevation on his jump shot. And I mean, the mechanics aren't egregiously messed up. It's really just kind of to do with his legs there. I think that is something, as young as he is, that he can definitely attend to and improve upon. Now, if that's going to hurt the Mavericks in year 1, especially if he, is in a starting role, if, his defensive upside is enough to bolster him into that starting lineup, I think that remains a really good question. If the Mavericks, could afford an individual in that lineup who at that spot, couldn't shoot. Especially with Luka and Kyrie's, dynamism in terms of being able to, get those corner shooters and those guys in the wing, those tailor-made sort of ready passes right in the, the shooter's pocket to where they can just go up. It's a different sort of level of speed and, just action, I guess, more so than he's used to, especially as he kind of spearheaded that OTE squad last year with Amen, right? Where they're basically, the primary ball handlers every single possession. So adjusting to that, as a lot of rookies have had to do, will be a big drawing point. But both of these kids, in terms of the Thompson twins, seem uber motivated and extremely disciplined in terms of, their work ethic, especially hearing some of the stuff in regards to what their, how their parents raised them and everything. So I wouldn't doubt that he, could definitely develop in that area. The question would just be, would it hurt the Mavericks in that, brief time that he is, still, working through a rookie role on that from that aspect, right? So we'll just have to see how that plays out going forward. But this guy is obviously one of the more dynamic defenders in the draft. Me and you went on to label him one of the better defenders in the draft. A couple of the guys we did last podcast in terms of Jarius Walker and Taylor Hendricks would maybe have something to say about. But in terms of, being a complete, just tried and true wing defender, a guy who can, really just lock down anybody at the point of attack because of his lateral quickness and speed, as well as be a great help defender in the half court and a really good off ball defender, with the ability to pick off passes. What are we going to get in terms of, if we were to add this guy, to the wing for the Mavericks, how much issues does that mend in terms of, one of the more, just, I don't know how to say this other than with discuss, but one of the more just atrocious wing defenses in the league last year that allowed a lot of slippages at the point of attack, just guys being, getting beat on single dribble blow-bys, things like that. How could, as dynamic as Ausar is in terms of, his ability to hedge and recover, and, honestly kind of just fly around the court. That's kind of his defensive style, and especially with his speed at his size. How much could he mend some of the Mavericks, current outlying defensive issues?
Yeah, he on the defensive end, he seems much more of sort of a floor general, similar to kind of what Dorian was. And I'm not saying he's going to be that good in the league, but I definitely do think immediately he will mend a lot of sort of holes that this team does have, a lot of questions that this team has. I think that he answers those and he'll fill those holes in very well. And yeah, as you said, his sort of screen navigating, defensively, his length, his ability to kind of just take control, just kind of be not a freelancer by any means, but he is sort of everywhere on the defensive end from what we could see.
Very switchable.
Yeah, very, very, very switchable. That's probably honestly one of his more underlooked sort of not achievements, but underlooked sort of abilities. Is he is very switchable from 1 through 4 rather. That could
Yeah, I'd agree.
really pose a good threat to. But yeah, I think that ability to be switchable, his ability to sort of take over, kind of be a general almost will definitely bode well in the Mavericks system. And not just defensively, but also offensively. That's going to lead to a lot of opportunities on transition. And we've seen, some guys sort of shine brighter than others on this team. And he would definitely be one that shines bright in that scenario. I know he hasn't played a game in the NBA, but I can already sort of predict that through what we've seen in the highlight tape. But yeah, as we said, he's got a high IQ for a sort of player at his age. He was able to lead him and Eamon were able to lead them, like I said, I believe to a championship. And again, as we said, there's definitely questions regarding his pro readiness. But yeah, I mean, they led that team to a championship, which I think definitely has something to say for what kind of player he is, what sort of leader he could possibly be. But yeah, on the defensive side of things, as we said, I think he's going to come in immediately and make changes possible. And yeah, I mean, that was probably the worst aspect of the Mavericks defense last year was their wing defense. It was just atrocious. It funneled everything inside, and our rim protecting defense was, of course, as awful as it always has been. And it didn't help that we had a very, very shit sort of defense on the perimeter. So I think he would definitely mend a lot of those. Not saying he'd be the total sort of answer, but I do think that he'd come in and make an effect, a positive effect rather, in day one.
Yeah, I would definitely tend to agree with you in regards to all of that. What do you think in terms of his offensive game? Like, can he what exactly could he definitively improve in terms of his offensive game? We obviously talked about, some of his flaws, how he could potentially be, more limited just kind of overall coming into his NBA career in that regard. But he does show a lot of promise in terms of, I guess, just maybe his basketball fluidity. He's a very fluid player. Everything that he does looks good. He's kind of like one of those guys, if that makes sense. So, like, what areas, show promise, but, are definitely like cause for improvement at the same time, specifically areas that if he were to develop, this guy could be, a real sort of all-star force, later in his career if he were to hit.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of those has to be shooting, as we mentioned before. I won't go too in detail into that for obvious reasons, but not just that, but also his playmaking. I know in transition he's one of the better playmakers in this draft. But if he could find some sort of half court sort of playmaking ability, I think that would bode him really well. I wouldn't even list him as a one-dimensional player coming in this league. But there definitely is concerns there. But yeah, I think, if he was in the Maverick system, of course, I think that he would definitely be one of the more sort of multi-tool, multi-facet kind of guys on this roster. And I think coming in immediately, we would see those effects. Offensively, again, I think his lack of shooting would almost make him more of a playmaker, would make him more of a off-ball cutter, something that this team just doesn't have enough of. So I think what this team doesn't have, he'd definitely sort of fill. Not saying like I said, he wouldn't be the answer day one, but he would definitely sort of be a standout role player within the system. And yeah, as I said, I think driving angles, just sort of like the more of the fundamental things are the things that he could improve on. Shooting, driving angles, as I said, getting to his spots, making intentions clear, because there was sort of a lack of aggression, I think, or not a lack of aggression, but sort of just effort plays, sort of discipline plays, like things like that, where they're coachable, granted some effort, and I think if they can find that sort of ability, I think that he could definitely be, one of the more multifaceted guys, as I said before. We've always been pining for the DeAnthony Meltons of the world. We've always been pining for, the more, or I guess, or rather less, one-dimensional guys on this team. And I think that he would definitely be one of the first out of the gates to be that sort of multifaceted guy that we could use. And I mean, honestly, I know we're kind of getting into his role here, but I think that he probably would start day one. There might be concerns there, but I think that, he'd probably start day one if he was drafted with that 10th pick.
Yeah, I mean, in regards to what I think he could, improve upon, but like I said, it still does look like a fluid process, even on a lot of these misses. Would definitely just be, how he sizes guys up one-on-one, and his kind of his just decision-making process. I wouldn't say he has a weak handle, because he can get really flashy with it, and he has a really good dribble package, but when he is getting hounded by a defender that has a tendency to kind of fall apart, he doesn't have the strongest arms with the basketball. So that kind of goes hand in hand in terms of like being able to get to a spot like you talked about, and just getting a little bit more creative, especially with inside the painted area. How he can use angles to his advantage to, fake out defenders and get to the rim, things of that nature. I do think that he may have relied on athleticism a little bit too much, trying to get to the rim. And, it led to some sort of wild attempts where, he contorted his body midair and, kind of swooped his arms around, trying to make a layup, things like that. But in terms of, how that's going to translate to the NBA, it's going to be a lot harder to pull that sort of, stuff off. Guys are a lot better at pulling the chair. They're not going to, concede into giving you that contact that you want. They're going to take a charge a lot more often, or they're just, kind of get out of the way and, make you think twice about the decision you made. So, we'll see, how much hesitancy versus, like sort of a affirmative aggression and assertiveness he's able to kind of establish, and especially in terms of his driving, because I think that will be a big like day one sort of thing that he can improve upon the most his rookie year, because the shooting will probably kind of come and go throughout the year, and that'll be something that we'll just sort of appreciate in terms of, as time kind of goes on. But that his driving game, I think he's just so good of an athlete that could improve, throughout the coming months of his rookie season. If and summer league, if he were to get drafted, obviously by any team, but specifically the Mavericks, and I think it could really be one of the biggest safe havens for him to go to in terms of when he needs to get a bucket, what can he go to? I think that'll be his biggest thing his rookie year, is figuring out what his sort of default offensive cog that he can kind of fill from a creation or a shooting aspect. How can I get a bucket when it matters? And that'll be something that evolves throughout his career. But if he has to evolve that in terms of his mid-range and 3-point shooting, I mean, this guy, his ceiling is through the roof, figuratively and literally. So Jaren, we've talked ad nauseum about this guy's positive, negatives. Honestly, kind of talked about his role in the Mavericks and how it would relate to Luka and Kyrie. He'd obviously be, that ultimate sort of 3-and-D, quote unquote wing, if you will, that's, going to come in, likely start next to those guys, run the floor, and just try to fill in the gaps wherever he can. And, just kind of see where his offensive game comes along with that, of course. What do you think this guy's ceiling and his floor is?
Yeah, I think his ceiling, I think that he has the potential. He honestly has one of the higher potentials in this draft. If everything were to hit, of course, I think that he would probably be one of the better guys in the league. Probably a consistent all-star. Not saying that this would be his role by any means, but, I think he'd be an excellent two guy similar to Klay Thompson. I just think that his abilities, his sort of playmaking, and, the offensive skill that he could possibly achieve, And on top of that, his defense is amazing. I think that if all of that sort of equates and all of the things that are developing do develop, I think that he'd become one of the best sort of all-around players in this league. And similar to his brother, if both of them rather, that would be absolutely incredible. I think that's sort of his ceiling, which would probably be a consistent two guy on any roster that he'd be put on. And not just that, but adding that to his floor. He probably has one of the more higher bust potentials in this draft because again, we don't know what we're getting out of him. Being that they're from OTE, there is a lot of questions there. Their pro availability, everything along the lines of that. I think that he probably has one of the more high bust potentials. So I think, sort of his floor would be a role player, where, maybe not one dimensional by any means, but just kind of lacks the ability to shoot, and is really restricted by that alone, especially offensively. Like, I think he's going to be one of the better defensive candidates, in the league for years to come. Once that sort of develops and everything after those first few years in the league. I do think that he'll probably be one of the best defenders in the league, granted. But offensively, I think that he could be limited. Let's say he doesn't sort of achieve his shot diet. Even his playmaking doesn't sort of, go to par. Like, I think that he would be much more sort of restricted in the things that he could possibly be, or could possibly do. But I think that at the very worst, he's probably going to be a role player. Definitely more defensive minded. Probably coming off the bench for some sort of team. I don't know, but that's absolutely like his floor. And yeah, like I said, his ceiling, I think he'd be an excellent two guy. I just don't think he has the ability to become a star. Now, I may swallow my words here in a few years, but I just don't think he's that sort of number one guy that can lead his team to a
But
championship.
what do you mean by that? Like, because
Again, we haven't
do you
seen
think
enough,
he could
but
be? Do you think he could be an all-star, or do you just not think
yeah, I think he could be an all-star. I
he
think
just can't be a 1A player on a championship team? Is what you're saying?
that's what I'm saying. Yes, but
Yeah.
again, we haven't seen enough. I don't know. I think after his rookie year, a lot will tell. But yeah, I'm that's my sort of prediction is that he, at the very best he could be, he is going to be a multi-time all-star, like I said, and just an excellent two guy on any roster. So, but yeah, definitely his ceiling. I think he could be much more restricted on that shooting or the lack of shooting. And let's say the playmaking doesn't sort of equivalent to the NBA level. I think that we could definitely see a drop off there. Or if everything doesn't develop, like I said, there could be a drop off. And yeah, I think that could restrict his game pretty immensely. But like I said, I don't think that there's gonna be anything where he's out of the league in a few years or anything like that. Like, I don't think he'll have that big of a drop off. But I just think his game is much more developmental, especially on the offensive end. And if he does sort of come to that, like I said, I think that'll be his ceiling, his floor. Not saying it's a bad floor, but compared to what he could have been, it's probably a pretty low floor.
Yeah. My floor rather is even a little lower, I would say, if I had to project for him, because I even think that you can attribute some of how good he was on defense to some of the competition he was playing. His ability to kind of just freelance on the floor. NBA offensive players could easily kind of scout out when his trap is coming, or when he's coming from the weak side, and still be able to maintain possession of the ball. So for reasons of that nature, I would say his floor is like maybe like a Greg Brown the third type player, like a guy that was very uber talented coming into high school, college, all that sort of stuff, but the lack of just kind of discipline offensively and defensively was something that came back to bite him, and he had to kind of just rely strictly on his athleticism. Now, I just think I think that he's just too savvy of an athlete, and just a basketball player in general, in terms of how hard he works, for that to be the scenario that kind of occurs here. But I do think that there's an off chance if things were just to go completely off kilter for him, that he's kind of relegated to one of those guys. It's just the the sort of flyer athlete, wing on every team that has a lot of potential to evolve into something, but it's just going to be completely predicated upon how much they can develop the other areas of their game. And like you said, his ceiling, I think, is through the roof. Think of any 3-and-D two-way wing in today's game, whether it be like Paul George. I'm bluffing in terms of trying to find
Jalen Brown.
Jalen Brown. Yeah, like, I mean, he's of that pedigree. So if things are to pan out for him in terms of, just his whole, like his basketball fluidity. That's the best way I could describe it. When you watch this guy. So it'll be real intriguing to see exactly what happens. Like last podcast where we did the draft profiles, we're going to be diagnosing a boom and bust rating for every guy that we do. And for Ausar, of course, me and Jaren obviously kind of just talked in this last 5 or 10 minute segment or whatever, just how volatile he is as a player, in terms of where we think his career could pan out. So in terms of my boomer bust rating, I would probably go like a 9 on this one. This might, 9.5. This is a more, one of the more just extreme cases in this draft of a guy that could end up at either side of, the extremes on the totem pole.
Yeah, I mean, I would digress a little bit. I'd probably go with an 8 or a 7.5, just because, again, yes, his ceiling is so high, but his floor again is very low. Not saying that floor will happen or anything like that, but there is definitely some risk to be taken there. And yeah, I mean, I think honestly, I do agree with what you said though. And his ceiling, as we said before, I think we could be looking at, everyone goes through these amazing drafts and always does a redraft. Luka goes number 1, all that sort of thing. I think that, in 5 years time or whatever, assuming everything does work out, he could probably be a guy that jumps up into that 3 spot, with Victor and sort of Scoot. And not saying that's an amazing thing because it's, not what it is going to be, but I'm just saying he could possibly be sort of this number 3 guy sort of headlining this draft. And yeah, I mean, there could be a lot of teams that look at this and probably ask what they were thinking. But again, there could be some teams thinking that, oh, I'm glad I didn't take this shot, because again, he is a big risk. He is a big risk for any roster, because of his sort of upside and his sort of bust potential. But yeah, I think we probably share the same in terms of that boomer bust rating. I know you said a 9 and I went with like an 8, but I feel like we have pretty similar reasons as to why.
Yeah, and then for our NBA player comparison, we both labeled Andrew Wiggins. Wiggins may be a little bit bigger body at this stage in his career, but you see, we wanted to kind of find the middle ground, I guess, in terms of how high his ceiling is, but as well as how low his floor is. And I thought Andrew Wiggins was pretty emblematic of that. A guy who's had very high expectations coming in, kind of fizzled out, was maybe asked to do a little bit too much, but once he was relegated to being more of a pseudo shot creator, a guy who can pull up for a mid-range jump shot or get to the rim when he really needs to, but it's not something essentially the team requires from him. And it gives him the ability in that Golden State system to kind of just focus more on defense. I think that's the sort of middle ground you're looking at when we talk about Ausar Thompson, in terms of what if he doesn't end up at both sides of the extreme side of the spectrum, we could see some sort of career trajectory on that sort of path for him. But obviously it's pointless to predict exactly what's going to happen, because these guys are also raw, also young. We earnestly really don't have a clue, but I did think that guy was the sort of mean value in terms of Andrew Wiggins when we're looking at guys that are comparable from an NBA perspective to Ausar Thompson. So with that being said, that flushes the Ausar Thompson draft profile away. Out of all the guys we talked about, definitely another one of the more captivating prospects. We've looked at a guy that if he were to drop to 10, the Mavericks would definitely probably have some hesitancy before they picked up the phone and made a trade. Just because of what he could provide in the ensuing years. He's not as highly touted as his brother, but I mean, guy is still definitely a freak athlete. And I mean, at the end of the day, the Mavericks have not had enough athletes within the past 10 or 15 years, especially in this year's rendition of the team. Josh Green, probably the only guy that's scratching maybe 35, 36 inches on a vertical jump test. So maybe throw Jaden Hardy in there too. If we're talking about running vertical jump, standing one, there's a lot of guys on the team that are maybe toast from that perspective. Besides, good old Dwight Powell, I feel like he could get up there for the one time. But other than that, we are going to go ahead and head into the draft profile for Gradey Dick. 6'8", 200-pound forward out of Kansas. I think that after Christian Braun's recent success last night, winning the NBA championship, I know we didn't mention in the first segment, but of course the Nuggets won the championship, so shout out to them. Definitely not the most exciting finals, I think, of the last few years, but I do think that they established, just how serious and competitive that group and that roster that they've built over there is, and showcased how you can essentially curate a roster around one or two superstars, because I think Jamal Murray is soon going to be entering that tier, if he's able to um, carry on what he's been doing during the playoffs ever since his knee is kind of fully healed here into next year's regular season. How can an NBA roster essentially best curate their role players around that? You see a sort of Class A masterpiece there with what the Denver Nuggets have done, and just how dynamic really all the guys in that lineup are in terms of attacking off closeouts, in terms of cutting, in terms of shooting. Everybody is extremely locked in, around those two centripetal driving forces in Jokic and Murray, and that's the blueprint right there for the Mavericks, behind Doncic and Irving. So that's why this draft and these draft profiles that we're talking about here are so important, because if the Mavericks were to somehow screw up this 10th pick, whether it be in the manner in which they traded it, or who they actually selected, it could have huge ripple effects in terms of how the future of the franchise is perceived, how Luka perceives the future of the franchise. They already got lucky enough to retain it. They wouldn't ever dare have enough luck to be able to move up in the draft, as since they never have moved up in the draft lottery in franchise history. But this is obviously something that they can't waste. Hence why I can't stress the importance of this enough here. So with that being said, let's get into the Mavericks' best prospect they could select in this draft, and Gradey Dick here. There was obviously some loaded sarcasm there for you guys that couldn't catch that, but nonetheless, Gradey Dick, I think, is kind of being labeled as that one sort of white shooter that just shouldn't be in the realm of consideration for a team that really needs defense, really needs rim protection. He doesn't fill any of those immediate voids maybe as much as some of these other guys on this list, but he still does have some 6'8", some defensive upside. He's 6'8" with about a 7-foot wingspan. He's definitely not a trapezoid. He has really good length to him. He is a pretty sound basketball defender. He has a really good defensive IQ, in terms of being at the right spot on the floor when he needs to be. Makes good rotations, in the same vein that in a guy that we talked about earlier with Ausar. He is a really good off-ball defender, but a lot of his mishaps are going to come in terms of being a low post defender, especially at that 6'8", 6'9" frame. He's probably going to get switched on to a lot more bigger guys, maybe at times. And does he even have the base or the wherewithal to be able to sort of withstand against those sort of guys in terms of them attacking his hip, or them posting him up? Those are going to be like huge questions for him. But he's a decent recovery defender with his length. There were a few times that he kind of got beat off of blow-bys where he was able to kind of recover to knock the ball loose in some sort of capacity. So like I said, very savvy, very smart on that end. But obviously the lack of lateral quickness at the point of attack, as well as just an overall need for improvement in terms of his strength and athleticism overall for the NBA level, are going to be the hugest questions going into that. He could get away with some of those sort of recovery tactics in college. Will he be able to get away with the NBA? That's going to, we'll just have to see how that plays out, because this is a guy that could be, an above average defender, I think, coming in, if everything were to click right and he adds a little size before heading into the league, and, takes real good care of his body and is, still extremely serious and diligent about that side of things. But, if he comes in and treats it the wrong way, this is a guy that, we could be looking at like a Davis Bertans level defender here if things were to go haywire. So what are your thoughts on Dick, Jaren, in terms of his defense?
Yeah, I think I think Gradey Dick, in terms of defense, there's definitely more questions than answers. He is a decent one-on-one defender, but with his size, he's going to be asked to defend a lot of the bigger guys in this league. And as you said, there isn't a lot of mass, there isn't a lot of muscle on his body. And likely he probably would be bullied in those sort of scenarios. He'd be bullied down low. His lack of, I think that makes him actually very less switchable within a system. I think that you'll definitely be playing a lot more scram defense if that is the case where he is switched onto some sort of these bigger guys. I think Aaron Gordon, shout out to the Denver Nuggets. I think Aaron Gordon would take sort of huge leaps and bounds over this guy.
He would grab him by the throat and then slam him into
Yeah.
extension, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that those questions on defense are definitely they're definitely valid. His sort of lack of athleticism, or not athleticism by any means. He's honestly pretty athletic for his size and for what he does, but lack of defensive athleticism is probably the best way
I would just say like lack of lateral quickness. He's decent, kind of line to line, straight line speed guy, and he covers. Maybe he's not the best vertical leaper, but he covers a lot of ground. With his stride when he leaps, so he's took off from pretty far on a few of these dunks, throughout this past season with Kansas. But yeah, just improving those sort of intangibles, and these are all things that he can improve upon. He can definitely become like a much better athlete. He has a good frame. He has really good length. I think that a lot of people automatically are kind of label him as the unathletic white guy or whatever. And I think that those labels are kind of fair and somewhat applicable right now, but I wouldn't say that he has like a Luka body type to where he has only a certain ceiling that he's kind of relegated to athletically. I do think that there are levels to this to which he can improve, and I think it would be most beneficial to his NBA game, based on the sort of movement shooting style that he has. If he could develop on both sides of the ball, you're looking at a pretty transcendent 3-and-D player here, almost a carbon copy of like a Klay Thompson if he were to improve around the margins athletically, just get to the stage of at least like Klay Thompson-esque where he can be a really good cutter, which he already honestly kind of is. He's really good at rejecting pin downs and kind of faking out on them, and just finding the different cutting lanes within the half court offense. He is just very savvy in terms of his understanding of spacing within the half court offense. He really could be a tried and true 3-and-D movement shooter if things were to pan out defensively. But as I noted, for obvious reasons, those defensive concerns are going to be huge, because this is not a guy that may have the time this offseason to come in and automatically be a defensive stopgap for the Mavericks once they enter training camp. This is definitely a guy that could take maybe a couple years before that game, and that side of things at least is at its full amplification. That may not be something that he's going to have NBA ready, in my opinion. That could definitely hurt his selection with the Mavericks going forward. But I mean, look, they worked him out, so it's just something that we're obviously going to have to see about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're definitely, as we said before, there's a lot of questions on the defensive end. But I think granted a few years, like you said, the defense could possibly be there. I think this definitely goes a little bit more in the ceiling and floor category, but at the absolute worst, I think that he's probably going to be more of a Davis Bertans sort of 3-point specialist guy. And at the absolute very best, he could probably be one of the more versatile 3-and-D guys in this league. But yeah, offensively, I think that we probably covered all of his negatives. Offensively, though, is where we see the true and real positives. Pretty much there is not a hole outside of athleticism with Gradey Dick's game offensively. Like I said, he's a great catch and shooter, great movement shooter, great on the one-on-one scenarios. a great rebounder for his size and for sort of what he does. A really good effort guy. And like I said, he's probably the best shooter in this draft. For any kids out there listening to this, I doubt that there is, but for any kids out there that's listening to this, probably model your jump shot after Gradey Dick, because it is one of the more mechanically sound jumpers in this league, or coming into this league, I should say. And yeah, I mean, he's just an all around really good offensive player. Like I said, from the 3-point line is sort of where his game sticks out compared to others, but he also does the sort of little things inside the paint, as I mentioned before, rebounding, effort plays, 50-50 balls, all of that is sort of something that you can definitely look at and see the potential there. He's a great off-ball cutter, as we said, a great off-ball mover, fills the spaces very well. He's honestly understands half-court spacing probably better than Ausar Thompson, as we mentioned before, and he understands it very well. And yeah, I mean, this guy is an all-around offensive IQ sort of guy. If he can sort of just develop a defensive game, that's sort of where his sort of ceiling caps, or not ceiling, but that's sort of where his floor is in question. But yeah, I think he's definitely one of the more all-around sort of offensive guys. And he does lack a little bit of creativity in the one-on-one. But if he can find some sort of athleticism there, maybe I don't know about lose some weight, but put on some muscle, possibly get some athleticism in the questions there. He is a young player after all. Then there could definitely be a scenario where he sort of is, a creative one-on-one guy where he can take guys off the dribble, maybe do a pull-up midi off of like some sort of crossover jab or something. But yeah, I mean, right now, very fundamentally sound, which is funny saying for a white guy because that's sort of the stereotype. But very fundamentally sound. He relies a little bit on the triple threat, a little bit too much in my opinion. That's sort of where his bread and butter sort of is in the one-on-one. I just don't think that, using that sort of ability alone in the NBA is going to get him or get him anywhere compared to what he got to in college. But again, I think his shooting alone probably sticks him above and, definitely has him on a few NBA rosters at the very least because of his shooting alone. But yeah, as we said before, the developmental issues are on the offense or on the defensive thing rather, or defensive side of the ball. Jesus. And yeah, I mean, if he could sort of get a consistency on defense, that's really where we could see this guy elevate above others.
Yeah, and I mean, just opening up his bag a little bit more offensively is going to be a huge drawing point for him in terms of just kind of how one-dimensional he is at the NBA level, right? I definitely wouldn't say that he was one-dimensional offensively in terms of, only being a guy who can, come off a screen and pull up or catch and shoot. He had a decent attack off a closeout, had a pretty good up fake, knocked in a few mid-range jump shots because of that. Was a good cutter, obviously. Showed the ability to get to the rim and use his length to finish. Now, even in college, we did see, if he was attacking off a closeout going to the rim, that, the lack of size there, could burden him at times. He doesn't have, like I said, the most creativity in terms of being able to get himself open one-on-one. A lot of his, scoring that he does is predicated, off fundamentals and the right scenario kind of being, applied there, right? If he, attacks off a closeout, has an open mid-range jump shot, or if he's just shooting over the top of guys, he relies heavily on his repetition and what he, has done in terms of his development of shooting up to this point. But there, in terms of he's definitely not a guy, especially, if he has somebody kind of head up on him then, and they've been hawking him down all game. He's not a guy that you want to give the ball to at the end of a shot clock. A guy like Ausar Thompson, I know we didn't really mention this, but he showed a little bit of promise in terms of making some difficult shots despite, his sort of lack of creativity. Like we talked about, Gradey Dick, as good of a shooter as he is, unless, you have him coming off of a DHO or it's a sort of designated play, it's just going to be harder for him to really account and furbish for his own offense when there's not a play drawn up. That's when he may struggle a little bit. He is a pretty savvy transition player, is something I kind of noticed. He knows how to run the floor and get to guys. Like I said, he does have a really good basketball IQ, but I do think his just lack of an overall, bag offensively in terms of his handles and his shot creation is something that could burden him. at certain points. So we'll have to see how that pans out. But one thing, that really did surprise me in terms of his game was his ability to get those 50-50 balls in terms of the rebounds and stuff like that you had mentioned, Jaren, especially for a guy that I wouldn't say is the best boxer outer. He does have a sort of nose for the ball, understands angles in terms of where it's coming off really well, and uses his length to go get rebounds. So that there's a lot of offensive positives, and this guy's fundamental base is so good that if he can just open up his game a little bit more on both sides of the ball, this could be a really good player coming out. He's young still. He was only a sophomore this past year. There's a lot of layers to how good this guy could be yet again after covering Ausar Thompson the previous profile. But I would say that Gradey Dick definitely is a little bit more surefire in terms of where his baseline floor is. And I do think, I wouldn't say that there's a certain cap he can get to, because if things were to pan out for him offensively and defensively, he could become a really elite player. But I do think it's going to be harder to, override some of the sort of deficiencies in his game than it would be for an Ausar Thompson. Because I think, Gradey Dick's obviously involving a little bit more, in terms of working on his body, but also, adding that, just sort of it factor in terms of being able to go get a bucket, when need be, by himself, using his handles and his size, things of that nature. That's going to be something that I think is just going to be a little bit more tough for him to bring along into the league. He does have, a little bit of, sort of jab crossover, as Jaren alluded to, and a jumper off that, but it doesn't cover the most ground I've ever seen. And I think it could be a little easier to guard, especially at the, the NBA level compared to the college level, where we can kind of just use his length advantage in that situation to, sort of just shoot over the top of guys. So, look, just evolving his bag offensively, and then, becoming obviously more of a transcendent athletic guy defensively, are going to be this guy's, keys to becoming, one of the more grade A role players in this draft. But only time will tell to see if he can expand upon, those deficiencies. But as is, I still think that he has a fairly good baseline, even if things don't pan out. If he's able to at least carry over everything that he could do in college, then I'd say that you're looking at a pretty solid role player that can, be, maybe not starting for every single team in the league, but can definitely be starting or one of the first guys off the bench for almost any team in the league. I know we wrote down Cam Johnson here for the comparison, but one guy that I kind of see here, it's kind of sprinkled in his game. I know we're not technically at the comparison part yet, but I do see a lot of like Kevin Huerter in this guy's game. Okay defender, but just great cutter, great movement shooter is what I would probably try and relate him to for people that really don't know him out there.
Yeah, I'd honestly second you with that. I think that's a great comparison. I was going to say something along the lines of a less athletic Michael Porter Jr. Just someone, lengthy. You don't notice the defense, but the defense is there. And offensively, they're going to get what's theirs. I think that's probably, both really good comparisons for what his sort of ceiling could be. Just to, at the very highest level, a standout role player. At the very lowest, on his ceiling, probably a Kevin Huerter, a guy who's going to produce, but isn't, necessarily noticed on that starting five. And then at the very worst, I think it's more of a sort of Davis Bertans. He's going to play every now and then, but definitely much, relies very heavy on that 3-point shot and offensive creativity. And that's just something that, we've seen nowadays in the NBA just doesn't really equate over a multi-year period. So at the
he could definitely
worst,
have a role in this league, but how big is it going to be would be the question if he were to sort of pan out to being just a pure movement shooter who is extremely limited in other categories. And I mean, honestly, like I do think that his ceiling may even be, slightly higher beyond role player. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say all-star tier, but, I think at the high end of things, you could see this guy panning out into possibly like a Bojan Bogdanovic. Am I too far off and from that standpoint?
I don't think that you're too far off. Athleticism too. Like, maybe Bojan kind of or maybe not a little bit, but like he's just a little bit more creative than what I think he could be. But yeah, I mean, if everything does hit right, that could be honestly a fair comparison.
They're fairly on par athletically, and Bojan's
Yeah.
he's a guy that I can't speak for how he played in Europe, but he's really over the course of his NBA career came to mold his defense around just of how good conditioning he's kept himself in, and just how savvy and what his basketball IQ is, and Gradey Dick has better athletic tools than him, for instance. But if things were to really pan out, I could see him getting to that sort of tier of things. I should have prefaced, maybe more of a, Bojan Bogdanovic, if he were to have entered his prime when he was like 29, comparable to, like 33-year-old Bogdanovic. So, I think he may have, it's kind of debatable, but and completely off topic, but I think Bogdanovic maybe could have had a little, bit of more of a transcendent impact in the NBA if he came over a little bit earlier from Europe. So I don't know. I see that, a lot of different guys kind of sprinkled in here. But this is a guy that, in terms of his role, is going to be, a pure movement shooter. He's going to be running a lot in offense, a lot of staggers, a lot of pin downs are going to get set for him. He's, going to be expected to knock down. And if he doesn't, he's going to fizzle out kind of like a Bertans. But if he's able to capitalize upon his role and expand upon, just that pure shooting, he can attack off a closeout, develop his defense. This could be a guy that, could be starting for the Mavericks. I wouldn't take that out of account if they were to select him at 10. I think there's a world in which he's starting if everything were to go right this year, but we would just have to see exactly what happens in that regard. I also think that there's a role where he's, not playing like almost whatsoever and is relegated to the G League. So we'll have to see. But, if I had to project exactly where he would fit in, I would say somewhere in that 6 to 8, sort of slot in the rotation if he were to get drafted by the Mavericks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's honestly very fair for a role. I think it's someone sort of the Bertans that we never got, where his offense is going to be there. He's going to have that offensive impact, and it's going to be guaranteed impact. Rather, compared to Bertans, like you're going to get it, but is it going to be that kind of night? You just don't know. I think he's definitely going to be much more of a rotational guy compared to that. But yeah, I think that's probably pretty fair. If he were going to be on this Mavericks roster, it would probably be in that 6 to 8 range. And again, I can't preface this enough, but if the Mavericks do select not Christian Brown, Gradey Dick with that 10 pick, I think that the Mavericks will be making, or at least have trades lined up, for the defensive side of things. So I think that, honestly, if the Mavericks were to select him with the 10th overall pick, there'd be a lot of questions for obvious reasons. But we've said this before. Again, I mean, the Mavericks probably have a plan, but you never know. But that would be
they're multiple moves away. It's not just
exactly
Mavericks aren't solving all the, as much as we're gonna talk about these guys, they're not solving all their issues through one player. So you would hope at least. Maybe they are. I don't know. I'm done. I'm done depending on them to fix my mental health. It's not a battle that is worth fighting. But yeah, I mean, in terms of Gradey Dick, this is obviously a guy that, could really be a serviceable role player in this league. These Kansas guys out here that Bill Self's producing, out here winning chips, Christian Braun, another white guy that I think a lot of people kind of threw under the bus, went, I believe, 20 or so last year in the draft. And I mean, he is a starter, role player, or not starter, but I mean, he's, in that 6 to 8 slot on a championship team. That's, what I think Gradey Dick could do if things were to come into fruition for him. But, he obviously does have some, sort of bust potential associated with him. Jaren, what would you sort of diagnose his boom and bust rating to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, probably at the 10 pick or, even beyond the 10 pick, he's probably much more of what you're expecting to get, a role player or a standout role player at the very best, not someone who's going to start or going to be a star or anything. So I would probably go with a, probably like a 7 or 6.5 in that rating, just because he's much more of a sort of safe player in the sense that if he hits, he's going to be a guy that you kind of need on a championship roster. If he doesn't hit, it's going to be a nice icing on top to have some shooting there. And at the very worst, he could be out of the league in a few years. But I think that it's probably generally a safe pick for any team other than Dallas. And I mean that's saying a lot, but every team needs shooting. Every team needs sort of a long sort of 3-point shooter, 3-and-D sort of guy. So there are some sort of intangibles in his game that if he can sort of progress and develop, he'll definitely be higher standards compared to kind of what we're talking about him right now. But if everything does hit, I like I said, I think I could see him being one of the better role players in this league that a championship team has to absolutely have. But at the very worst, probably out of the league in a few years. And at the very worst, if he wants to stay in the NBA, it's going to have to be in sort of a Davis Bertans type role where he's just sort of used for his shooting and shooting only.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I think that kind of covers it in terms of Gradey Dick. Do you have anything else in terms of the guys we've covered today, or your excitement for the draft coming up here in 9 days, Jaren?
Yeah, I'm honestly really pumped for the draft. I think the draft is honestly it's sort of like the symbolic turning over the page into the next season. You kind of have 9 days to celebrate, or I guess rather get sad in your emotions that Denver won. For me,
I wouldn't say it's that. I'd say it's more like 9 days to relax for most.
It is 9 days to relax. Yeah,
yes.
For us, it's 9 days to bust out a lot of content.
Yes, yeah.
But no, yeah, I think yeah. Well, again, I mean, shout out to Denver. Like, they definitely well deserved in dominant fashion. But yeah, I mean, this is sort of that 9 day period where you're transitioning into next year. So once the draft comes along, it's gonna be. It's insane that it's 9 days away. I can't believe that, but I'm honestly I'm ready for it at this point.
Yeah, no, me too. I'm excited to get into it. We're gonna continue to get these player profiles out for you. You can catch all of our content being output on Twitter at just mainstream 214 at mainstream 214 is our Twitter. Make sure to follow us on YouTube, or subscribe rather. Mainstream Mavs podcast on YouTube. Comment down below. Who would you rather pick between Ausar Thompson or Gradey Dick if you are Nico Harrison, the Dallas Mavericks general manager, or the sort of a pseudo general manager, shadow GM, Mark Cuban? You know, whoever you think the GM is, who would you pick if you were him? Also, make sure to follow us or give us a 5-star rating and give us a good review. If you guys are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other additional podcast listening platform, we would really appreciate it. Thank you guys for listening this far. And the podcast has been Will with Mainstream Mavs. We really appreciate it. We will catch you guys in the next draft profile.
Bye-bye.